The Cuban Missile Crisis is often regarded as the one time the world almost came close to a nuclear disaster. But unknown to the world, not once, not twice, but several times the world came very close to a nuclear disaster. Sometimes it was timely human intervention that saved the day, and sometimes it was the machine that came to our rescue. Welcome to the 100th episode of the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at several times in history when the world almost experienced a nuclear disaster. By the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of two wires to cross, a nuclear explosion was averted. Those were the words of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, referring to a nuclear incident in North Carolina in 1961. A B52 bomber was flying over North Carolina on January 24, 1961. On board was a crew of 8 and 2 powerful hydrogen bombs. Unbelievable but true, this was a common practice during this era. The bombs weighed 10,000 pounds, and their explosive yield was 3.8 megatons. In comparison, the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 0.01 and 0.02 megatons respectively. Mid-flight, the B-52 aircraft suffered a fuel leak. The pilot tried to burn off the fuel before attempting to land at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina. This was done to lower the risk of the plane exploding if the landing went wrong. But the condition of the plane worsened and there was a failure in its right wing. It started losing altitude and began to break apart. The pilot ordered the crew to eject. 5 crewmen successfully ejected out of the bomber and landed safely. Another ejected but did not survive the landing, and 2 died in the crash. The bomber eventually disintegrated and crashed to the ground. As the plane started heading towards the ground, the plane's system started the process of arming the 2 bombs on board. The 2 bombs separated from the plane and started hurling towards the ground. The first bomb fell with its parachute open and was intact, standing upright, thanks mainly to the parachute getting caught in a tree. The bomb's arm safe switch ended up in the safe position while the rest of the arming steps had completed successfully. So a single switch out of 4 prevented the bomb from detonating. The second bomb left the plane partially armed, falling to the ground traveling hundreds of miles an hour, but it landed in a muddy field and disintegrated without detonating. Once again, it was a high voltage switch that prevented the bomb from fully arming. Because of groundwater flooding, crews were able to retrieve only the pit of the bomb, which is what is needed to trigger a nuclear explosion. They could not recover the secondary core containing most of the thermonuclear state that has the uranium and plutonium. It was lost hundreds of feet underground on the muddy field. Going by the population of North Carolina in 1961, if the 2 bombs had detonated, it is estimated that the death toll would have been 28,000, with 26,000 people injured. In July of 2012, the state of North Carolina erected a historical road marker in the town of Eureka, 3 miles north of the crash site, commemorating the crash under the title Nuclear Mishap. While the machine saved North Carolina, it was purely human intervention that saved the world from a nuclear catastrophe in September of 1983. The human was Soviet military officer Stanislav Petrov. In early September of 1983, the Soviet Union had shot down South Korean Airlines Flight 007 with two air-to-air missiles near Sakhalin Island. All 269 people on board had been killed, including US Congressman Lawrence MacDonald of Georgia. The Soviets claimed that the plane had strayed from its route into Soviet airspace, but President Ronald Reagan described the strike as an act of barbarism. NATO responded with a show of military exercises, including the deployment of new intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov characterized as a means for a first strike. On the night of September 26, 1983, in a small town 80 miles south of Moscow, in an underground bunker, Soviets were monitoring early warning systems for any alerts. The commanding officer was on leave, so the man in command was 44-year-old Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel whose day job was really systems administration, which involved troubleshooting the main computer which processed satellite data. Later in the night, the screen suddenly went red and a siren pierced the bunker. This normally signified a missile launch. As Petrov focused on the screen, it became clear that the screen was indicating a strike. But 15 seconds later, another signal showed up. Then another. Then another. Essentially, the system was telling him that 5 nuclear missiles had been launched from an American base in North Dakota. Protocol dictated that Petrov report the threat immediately to the top Russian commanders, who would likely initiate a Russian nuclear attack on the United States. 2 nuclear superpowers were on the brink of annihilation. But Petrov had been responsible for the design of the bunker and some of its technology, and he knew that the system was not 100% foolproof. And at that moment, with the sirens blaring, he began to reason with himself. In his gut, he had a feeling that the alarm was false, because he reasoned that when people start a war, they don't start it with just 5 missiles. After a lot of evaluation, Petrov determined that the odds of the nuclear strike were about 50%. And as a result, he categorized the alarm as a false alarm. As he was evaluating the outcome of his decision, he realized that if he was wrong, he would likely not live to be reprimanded. But if he was right, he had just stopped the world from World War III. And just a reminder, Petrov was the only one in that bunker that night of September 26, 1983, who had received a formal civilian education. The rest of his colleagues were all professional soldiers who had been taught to give and obey orders. After several long minutes, as Petrov realized that he and those around him were still breathing, it became clear that the alarm indeed was false. So why did the alarm go off in the first place? After a round of investigation, it was realized that the technology called OCO satellites mistakenly perceived sunlight on high-altitude clouds as ballistic missile engine exhaust. Sheer human intelligence and reasoning saved the day. The Soviet High Command kept this incident a secret, and Petrov was reprimanded for failing to record the event in his logbook. He was reassigned, and within the next year, he retired from the military to work for a research institute. It was only 13 years later, in 1996, that articles detailing the incident began to appear in Russian newspapers. And subsequently, in a 1998 memoir, a retired commander of the Soviet air defense finally credited Petrov for taking the correct actions in one of the most harrowing nuclear incidents of the Cold War. As the rest of the world expressed gratitude and hailed Petrov as a hero, he just brushed it off, claiming that he was just at the right place at the right time. In 2014, Petrov became the subject of the documentary The Man Who Saved the World, which is available on Amazon Prime Video. On May 19, 2017, Petrov died of hypostatic pneumonia at age 77, survived by his 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and the entire human race. The island of Greenland is situated about halfway between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, and has a strategic importance for the American military. So much so that the United States in 1946 made an unsuccessful bid to buy it from Denmark. Yes, you heard it right. President Trump is not the first American leader to propose a purchase of Greenland. So in 1946, despite refusing the US proposal for purchase, Denmark allowed the American military to operate an air base at Thule on the northwestern side of Greenland. On January 21, 1968, during the period of perpetual winter darkness, a B52 bomber was flying 35,000 feet above the glaciers and sea ice in northern Greenland, and in its belly, it was carrying 4 nuclear bombs. Wait, another B-52 carrying nuclear bombs? Why? Well, in the 1960s, the US flew B-52 bombers near the US as part of Operation Chrome Dome. This was a Cold War airborne alert program, and the goal was to keep nuclear-armed B-52s ready to retaliate against the Soviet Union in case of a nuclear attack. And during the course of its flight over Greenland, a fire broke out in the navigator's compartment of the B-52 bomber, and it was soon out of control. The pilot headed the bomber towards the Thule Air Base to attempt an emergency landing. But as the fire continued to spread, the crew members had to eject about 4 miles south of the runway. 6 of the 7 crew members parachuted to safety with only slight injuries. But the co-pilot, who did not have an ejection seat, was killed while trying to bail out. After it was abandoned, the plane did a 180-degree turn and crashed onto the ice of North Star Bay, 7.5 miles southwest of Thule. It skidded across the ice in flames and exploded, but thankfully the bombs did not detonate. The explosion led to a release of radiation from the plutonium in the bombs, and that caused fires which destroyed all 4. Wreckage of the plane was widely scattered in the area about 300 yards on either side of the plane's path. The accident was designated Broken Arrow, which means an accident involving a nuclear weapon, which does not present a risk of war. Within hours, the US Air Force activated the Strategic Air Command Disaster Control Team, which began a massive effort to recover all the contaminated debris. And the operation came to be known as Crested Ice. The spilled fuel was heavily contaminated, raising concerns that when the ice melted in the summer, the radioactive fuel would float onto the sea and subsequently contaminate the shore. So the Danes insisted that the spillover be removed to avoid this possibility, and they also requested that no nuclear material be left in Greenland after the cleanup. So the debris from the weapons was sent to the Pantex plant in Texas for evaluation, and the tanks were shipped to Savannah River in South Carolina. This crash severely strained the relationship between the US and Denmark, since Denmark's 1957 nuclear-free zone policy had prohibited the presence of any nuclear weapons in Denmark or its territories. The Thule crash revealed that the United States had actually been routinely flying planes carrying nuclear bombs over Greenland, and that caused the Danes to be very upset with the United States. Though the Strategic Air Command stated at the time of the accident that all 4 bombs were destroyed, reports surfaced in 1987-88, in 2000, and again in 2008 that one of the bombs had never been recovered. And the BBC report of 2008 was able to confirm this assertion with some of the officials who were involved in the accident's aftermath, who seemed to state that there was disappointment with the failure to retrieve all components, and they abandoned the search, realizing that it would be very difficult for anyone else to recover the missing pieces if they couldn't find them. The big impact of this 1968 incident was that Operation Chrome Dome, the operation to fly B-52s laden with nuclear bombs near the US, was shut down because the program had become too accident-prone. 1983 was a time of heightened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. US President Ronald Reagan did not get along with Soviet leader Yuri Andropov and had branded the Soviet Union an evil empire. In late 1983, NATO conducted a large-scale conventional military exercise across Western Europe. At the conclusion of this exercise, on November 7, 1983, around 100 senior military officers gathered at NATO headquarters in Brussels to fight a simulated World War III. And this simulation exercise was codenamed Able Archer. And this came at a time when both sides were in the process of deploying medium-range nuclear weapons. The simulation created a fictional scenario of turmoil in the Middle East, with Yugoslavia maintaining a neutral stance. The Soviet Union, concerned that some of its Warsaw Pact nations may switch their allegiance to the West, invaded Yugoslavia, followed by Scandinavia, forcing the overwhelmed NATO forces into retreat. To reiterate, this was a fictional simulation of a possible World War III scenario. So continuing with the simulation, with the retreat of NATO troops, the Western leaders got together and authorized the use of nuclear weapons. By November 11, 1983, the simulation had led to the global nuclear arsenals being unleashed and billions dead. By the end of that day, NATO commanders went back home, concluding the exercise, which they deemed was successful, though with terrifying consequences. It was only later that the Western governments discovered that this simulated exercise had come perilously close to instigating an actual nuclear war. Whoa, wait. How can a simulated exercise lead to actual nuclear tensions? The Soviets were aware of the traditional NATO exercise, but as part of the Able Archer program that simulated the World War III scenario, the exercise involved actual deployments on the ground, with some US air bases even practicing weapons handling, taxing out of hangars with realistic dummy warheads. And at this point, the Soviet leadership began to believe that Able Archer was not an exercise, but a cover for a genuine first strike nuclear attack. And they prepared to retaliate. When this news reached US President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, they were shocked to see that the Soviets believed that the West would initiate a first strike nuclear attack. A big lesson was learned out of this simulation, and subsequently, US President Reagan and the new Soviet Premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, embarked on a series of arms reduction treaties. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. From 1998 to 2024, who are the top two lobbyists attempting to influence government policy? With a total lobbying spend of about $2.9 billion, the US Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Realtors are the top two lobbyists. So the answer is A, US Chamber of Commerce and National Association of Realtors. Question for the current episode. In 1960, a radar from Greenland perceived moonlight as inbound Soviet missiles. However, when escalated to American leaders, they suspected a false alarm. What was the reason for that assertion? Was it A, there were no alerts on the other radars? B, the spy satellites did not report any missile launches from the Soviet Union? C, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was visiting the US at that time? Or D, a peace summit between President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Khrushchev was just a week away? Once again, in 1960, a radar from Greenland perceived moonlight as inbound Soviet missiles, but American leaders suspected a false alarm. Why was that? Was it A, because there were no alerts on the other radars? B, the spy satellites did not report any missile launches from the Soviet Union? C, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was visiting the US at that time? Or D, a peace summit between US President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Khrushchev was just a week away? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We'll meet again in 2 weeks with a new episode covering another interesting topic related to world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.